This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there, welcome to this edition of Global Business Africa. In the course of the hour, we'll run through the business news stories you need to know about from the continent and beyond. But first, a quick update as we wrap up the first half of the year on the market. So the midpoint of the year, the JSE indices have risen by the highest margin among the large sub-Saharan bourses that we do track on the program, gains of nearly 12% on the all share. Kenya's NSE 20 surprisingly has managed to eke out some gains over the last 6 months, going up by over 3% despite job losses last year, rising tides of public debt and weaker consumer spending that we've seen through most of 2020 and a very weak recovery thus far in 2021. Nigeria's main index has also fallen by nearly 6% so far in 2021. Further afield, the Nasdaq 12.6% higher so far in the year. Apple and Amazon driving gains in the index in today's session, but AMD not far behind. Shares in the processor maker, in fact, have turned positive for the year, up 1.5%. Here's what's coming up tonight. Uganda is targeting 500,000 households with $30 COVID-19 cash relief programs. Tobacco farmers in Zimbabwe rake in over $400 million 2 months into the new season. And the Chinese ride-hailing giant Didi Global has raised over $4 billion in its listing at the New York stock market. All right, then let's start the program tonight in Uganda, where the government has started to register the expanded 16 identified vulnerable groups eligible to receive roughly $30, give or take, in COVID-19 cash relief. Disbursement is expected to start within the next 2 weeks. Now, the government aims to reach some 500,000 households with this particular cash disbursement program. Here's CGTN's Isabel Nakiria reporting from Kampala.
Hassan Kasiria's van has been packed up for nearly 2 weeks since Uganda went into COVID-19 lockdown. He is a taxi driver in Kampala, but since public transport was suspended, he's not earning a living.
We taxi drivers are not doing well at all. From the owners of the taxi to us, who are employed to drive. The ordinary person is bad off. I call upon the president to remember us, the local people.
Hassan now spends time playing board games with his friends just to pass time. He's among the vulnerable groups who will receive a $30 cash transfer to help him and his family during lockdown. Families are expected to use the money for purchasing food and other household items. But Hassan says it's too little to meet his family's needs.
I beg the president to open up the country so that we can work and take care of our families, because the government will not be able to reach everyone with that money. When will it even reach us?
The government aims to reach about 500,000 households with this relief cash. The money will be transferred to mobile phone accounts. The cash transfers are yet to begin flowing into people's accounts, even when people have been home for close to 2 weeks. Last year, vulnerable groups were given food, but there were concerns that it wasn't enough and some people missed out in the handouts. A mobile van will also move to communities with cash to hand out to people without mobile phone accounts.
This 42 days vulnerable group is strictly those whom the lockdown measures interrupted their daily work, and their daily work is only when they work that they can earn something to eat.
The Uganda Bureau of Statistics will send teams to identify people eligible for this money. Categories listed include taxi drivers, hairdressers, teachers, musicians, pubs and nightclub workers, among many more. The government imposed a 42-day lockdown on 18th June to try and bring down infection rates, which had surged to over 1,000 per day. Uganda is going through a new wave of coronavirus that scientists say is more deadly. The Minister of Health says the numbers are now going down, but some urge restrictions on movement are preventing many people from accessing testing centers. And many who depend on daily earnings, like Hassan, say the government should allow them to work under strict rules so they can sustain their livelihoods. Isabel Nakiria, CGTN Kampala, Uganda.
Now, Tunisia's central bank governor has backed calls for the creation of an African central bank to enhance cooperation in the fields of finance and the integration of payment systems up and down the continent. Now, the creation of the African Union-backed bank is seen as a key to drive an economic rebound right across the continent, especially after all the damage inflicted by the pandemic. From Tunis, CGTN's Aden Chouachi.
The Tunisian Apex Bank governor noted that the African Central Bank's purpose will help build a common monetary policy in order to accelerate economic integration in Africa. Marwan al-Abbasi added that Tunisian transactions with the continent are limited and represent only 2% of the country's exports and 0.5% of its imports.
The African Central Bank project would boost Africa's economic integration. Efforts should be directed towards multiplying air, sea and land links between African countries. This will enhance the presence of banks to promote business and accelerate the establishment of free trade areas at the regional and continental level.
Experts say the World Bank expects investments ranging between $80 and $100 billion in Africa over the next 10 years. In addition, the IMF expects the total additional financing required by African countries during the period 2021-2025 to reach $285 billion.
Tunisia is facing a difficult economic crisis and a lack of liquidity. Many African economies are also facing similar challenges. That's why it's necessary to look for ways of financing investment and development projects in Africa.
Economists believe that the fight against the pandemic is a top priority in Africa. Therefore, successful vaccine rollout should drive an economic rebound.
As long as the vaccines are not available in Africa, we can't talk about economic recovery. The COVID-19 vaccine procurement is the real problem. Reopening the economy depends on the vaccine rollout.
Analysts assert that African central banks are boosting cooperation in the fields of finance, integration, as well as upgrading African payment systems.
The governor of the Central Bank of Tunisia called for mobilizing the support of multilateral financial institutions to back public investment in the digital sector in Africa. Al-Abbasi added that bilateral and multilateral cooperation are necessary to revive investment and growth in the continent. Aden Chouachi, CGTN, Tunis.
Still in that neighborhood, Egypt this week is marking the 7th anniversary since President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi took office in 2014. The North African state was rocked by months of uncertainty before an uprising toppled the former president, Mohamed Morsi, and the now outlawed Muslim Brotherhood. From Cairo, CGTN's Yasser Hakim looks back at the country's economic progress 7 years on.
When he took the oath of office in June 2014, President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi knew he was in for a rough ride. 2 uprisings and years of volatility had taken their toll on Egypt's economy.
The economic situation in Egypt was extremely dire. There was no security. Investors fled the country. Over 5,200 factories closed down. There was a shortage in energy, no fuel, no electricity, and the foreign reserves dropped to $13 billion, which was not enough to cover 3 months' worth of import needs. Unemployment exceeded 13%, and the deficit had risen to 13.7%. Egypt was on the verge of bankruptcy.
The Egyptian president quickly embarked on 5 years of austerity measures that included the devaluation of the Egyptian pound. Challenges on the road included a crackdown on terrorism, which had damaged vital sectors such as tourism and withheld investments in the country. However, the rebuilding process continued, with support from neighboring Gulf nations, international institutions such as the IMF, and friendly nations like China.
China is like a role model for the manufacturing, because China is a good example for the emerging multinational companies, and it is a role model for the companies that succeeded for globalization, and this is exactly what we want for Egyptian companies to go international and to go overseas. What is very obvious between Egypt and China is a cooperation in the manufacturing sector. Like we are inviting them to share the knowledge of the manufacturing. And we are providing good infrastructure, good facilities so they can come and invest with us in Egypt. So it's a matter of exchanging knowledge with resources.
And the president also shifted focus of his strategy towards the continent.
And one of the very good examples is happening is our cooperation with the African continent. And now you see how important it's turning. Now Egypt is taking a leading position in the continent. And now it's recognized as the country #2 in Africa economically. So definitely there is a big change. There is a very successful execution for the strategy and the plan.
Once stability had been secured, the positive effects of the economic reforms became evident. Egypt was one of only a few countries worldwide that posted positive growth rates amidst the fallout caused by the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020.
The foreign currency reserves reached over $40 billion. Deficit dropped to 7.5%. Unemployment dropped to 7%. And all this in the midst of a coronavirus pandemic. Exports jumped to $30 billion. President Sisi prioritized local production over imports and establishing local industries to raise production and limit imports. Egypt is now top in attracting foreign direct investment in Africa and second in the Arab world after the United Arab Emirates.
Now marching on to commence his 8th year in office, El-Sisi is pushing on his economic reforms in the North African state. Rebuilding continues, and there's an acceleration of projects to enhance an all-inclusive growth despite the post-COVID challenges which lie ahead. Yes, Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
From North Africa, let's head over to East Africa. The region's largest economy is failing to generate sufficient jobs, and that's especially critical in a decade when at least 10 million people will join its workforce in the decade between 2020 and 2029. Now, that's the assessment from the World Bank in its latest review of Kenya's economic performance. Let's look at some of the numbers here. The World Bank is estimating that in this decade, Kenya will have at least 1 million young people joining its labor force every single year. Now, if this surge in labor supply can be matched with quality jobs, the bank argues, that could power a significant rise in average household and per capita incomes as well. But if history is anything to go by, Kenya is going to have a very hard time absorbing the supply surge that's coming into the marketplace. You see, the 5 years to 2019, the country created an average of 100,000 new jobs in the formal sector, and the pace at which these jobs are being created was in steady decline from 2017. In fact, it hit a 5-year low in 2019, just before the pandemic hit. Now, most of Kenya's labor force is in one of two places. Either you're in agriculture or you're in services. Between them, that pair account for nearly 90% of total employment. Agriculture's productivity has remained virtually unchanged, really, since 2006, roughly $1,000 in value added per worker. Industry, where the average value add is 7 to 8 times higher, though, it's seen its share of employment decline between 2015 and 2019. In fact, in 2019, nearly 182,000 jobs were shed in that particular sector. So then, how can East Africa's largest economy turn this demographic time bomb, if you will, into a demographic gold mine? Let's explore that in some detail with Ramah Nyang. She's a senior economist in the Social Protection, Labour and Jobs Practice of the World Bank. She's also the lead author on this particular section of the Kenya Economic Update of June 2021. She's joining us now from Washington, D.C. Ramah, thank you very much for your time this evening. So unemployment tends to be the metric that gets a lot of attention, but underemployment is just as big an issue. How big a problem is that in Kenya's labour market, and how can we resolve it?
Thank you very much, I'm happy to join CGTN to discuss this issue today. As you mentioned, it is correct that underemployment is also a big issue. And though in Kenya, by measurement, it is not very big. So unemployment in 2015 was 3%, but underemployment, measured as those working less than 28 hours a week, plus unemployment, was about 12% in 2015. That went up to about 15% in 2019. Unemployment ticked up as well, but underemployment ticked up a little bit as well. When you compare that with other low and low middle income countries where you can have underemployment up to 40% of the economy, Kenya is doing all right.
So there's been this gradual shift away from agriculture, at least in the decade between 2006 and 2016. But productivity there, at least as measured by value addition, that's been completely flat for a very long period of time. What explains that trend?
So in the agricultural sector, there has been a lot of study for what is happening in Kenya, because agricultural productivity in Kenya is below that of comparator countries. And what we find is that the quality of inputs used in production is actually not very high. So the quality of seeds, the quality of fertilizers, the land size is decreasing. And that is some of the issues that prevail in the agriculture sector. You're also seeing some issues of climate change. So you're seeing some pests, some erosion of the value of the land and so on. So we are concerned about this, and I understand that different parts of the World Bank are providing advice to the government on what can be done to improve productivity.
Indeed. So nearly 70% of Kenya's population still resides pretty much in rural parts of the country. But as we're getting into this decade where you've got 1 million people coming into the workforce every single year, is this slow rate of urbanization, at least relative to other parts of Africa, is that slow pace of urbanization going to be a hindrance in getting these young people into the job market? Because, you know, if they're not where the jobs are and they don't have the skills that these urban environments require, that creates it complicates the problem, doesn't it?
So urbanization and economic growth are there's not a necessary hand-in-hand relationship. There are countries that have grown with urbanization. There are countries that have grown with less urbanization. Essentially, the more important aspect of it is connection to market. So for instance, in Kenya, again, if you looked at that period between 2005 and 2015, when economic transformation was happening in Kenya, the rate of urbanization was, the same as it is today. In fact, urbanization has accelerated a little bit. If you looked at the 2019 population census, it gives you a slightly higher urbanization rate than the UN population figures, and the UN population figures will be updated, of course, to the census. So urbanization is ticking up slightly, the rate of urbanization, and it has not been a constraint in the past. So a lot of it depends on what kind of jobs and how the economic growth is going to happen. So if a lot of economic growth in Kenya is through tourism or through higher productivity agriculture, then you can still have, a peri-urban population or more of a rural population and have good economic growth. Our interview today shows that technology is changing, and in developed countries, there's de-urbanization as people move away from very agglomerated cities. So the rate of urbanization necessarily is not a constraint to how quickly we can.
Okay, one last question for you, though. The study points out that, and this for me was a grim part of this entire study, the study points out that, look, we've improved access to education. That's improved significantly. But there's still a lot of work to be done in improving the quality of education. Everything from basic numeracy, literacy skills to computer skills that are now basically default mandatory pretty much in virtually any job we're talking about in the current economy. How big a problem is that lack of skills, that skills mismatch? How big a problem is it, and how can we remedy it? Because these are individuals who are already either in the workforce or in the workplace.
Thank you for that. I agree with you that that is one of the bigger problems facing Kenya today, because if you look at the type of growth that countries like Kenya are looking at, it is service sector growth, and it's high-end services sectors. So it's not taking labor off the farm and moving them to semi-skilled manufacturing. It is, moving labor into high-end services like financial sector and so on, where you do need both good quality and quantity of education. Kenya has done quite well on basic education. As you just mentioned, they've expanded access. the quality of basic education is also increasing. So if you look at the incoming cohorts, they do have higher skills compared to the cohorts that are already in the market. But your question is, what do we do with those that are in the market? So for those who are in the market, there are different ways in which you can go about it. One is a recognition of competencies. So when you're in a job, there is learning on the job. And sometimes that's not really captured very well in any kind of certificate. So if the person then wants to apply to move to a higher productive job, for instance, then their essential school certification may not allow them to move that quickly. So we understand that the government is coming up with some kind of certification of skills acquired. The second thing is we found success in what is called on-demand training. So it's not so useful to take people and then to put them in training classes if they are not that interested. But when people come and say, this is the type of learning I would like, be it digital skills, be it soft skills, foundational skills, if they are combined with good quality training institutions, but also with an employer who might potentially employ them in the future. So you get training, but you also get on-the-job learning. That works. And again, this technological improvements in digital delivery of learning can support improved skill provision to the existing labor force. You have to break it down into small, chunks that they can do around the jobs that they're working on and at their own pace.
Indeed, a bit of a silver lining to end that interview there with Ramah Nyang. She's a senior economist in the World Bank's Social Protection, Labour and Jobs Practice. Now, time now for a run through some company headlines. Let's start in the world of commodities. The mining giant Rio Tinto has declared force majeure on customer contracts at Richards Bay Minerals in South Africa. It comes after escalating violence forced it to suspend activity there. The closure of Rio Tinto's only South African business follows the death of RBM manager Nico Swart, who was shot on his way to work last month. All mining and smelting operations in RBM have been halted until further notice. The Kenyan alcoholic beverage manufacturer Keroche Industries has introduced a new beer brand that's targeting the high-end market, currently dominated by foreign brands. The brewer's latest product is sugar-free. It's dubbed X Beer, with an alcohol content of 8.8%. It'll retail at roughly $3 a bottle. Among popular Keroche products are the Summit Lager and malt beers, as well as the Vienna Ice and Crescent vodkas. The European Investment Bank has agreed to invest nearly $100 million in geothermal power projects in East Africa. Now, as part of its commitment to tackle global challenges, the EIB aims to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in East Africa by investing in renewable energy. The bank also plans to increase sustainable and reliable energy supply right across the region. And finally, Renault has unveiled a more ambitious strategy for electric vehicles. The French car maker is betting on new and affordable versions of its iconic small cars of the past to catch up with Volkswagen in that fast-growing sector. Renault aims to launch at least 10 new EVs by 2025. According to its CEO, the car maker and its alliance partners, Nissan and Mitsubishi, will be producing 1 million electric vehicles globally a year by 2030, up from the 200,000 that they made in 2020. That's a run through your company headlines. You're watching Global Business Africa. Time for a short break. Here's what's coming up next. Tobacco farmers in Zimbabwe rake in over $400 million 2 months into the new season. And South Africans are bracing themselves for sharp increases in fuel prices this July.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business, only on CGTN.
Every story starts out like this.
beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible and why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Sutra. Hello, Nairobi.
This is how all stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business.
Welcome back to the program. Tobacco farmers in Zimbabwe so far have raked in over $400 million in revenue 2 months after the tobacco marketing season started. That's a 40% increase in the volume of tobacco sold over the same period last year. As Farai Makutuya reports, more than 170,000 kilos of the leaf have been delivered to Zimbabwean auction floors, setting the country on course to achieve at least 220 tons of output.
Thanks to a good rainy season, the quality of the crop this year is better and has fetched an average price 13% firmer than last year. By the end of this selling season, farmers are expected to have delivered 9% more tobacco than they did during the previous one.
From the crop this year, farmers will actually earn probably plus or minus 540 million kilograms, and we might earn 1.5 times more from the export process.
Accounting for 21% of export earnings, the golden leaf, despite the health concerns, remains crucial for Zimbabwe's economy. Global demand for leaf tobacco is shrinking by about 2% per annum due to a growing anti-smoking lobby, as well as the emergence of alternative products such as e-cigarettes. In view of this, industry stakeholders have devised a strategy that will ensure the long-term sustainability of the sector as well as the survival of farmers. It involves mobilizing more domestic resources to finance the crop and improve leaf quality.
Smokers smoke for nicotine, and that comes from the flavor tobacco that we grow. So we will always remain relevant if we continuously improve our flavor type tobacco.
And encouraging farmers to leverage their current earnings to venture into emerging money spinners.
We are working with farmers in order so that they can diversify their economic activities at the farm. We want them to diversify with tobacco as an anchor crop. The revenue from tobacco can be used to grow other crops like cannabis for medicinal use, like industrial hemp, or any other food crops or energy crops.
The government has said it plans to ramp up production and increase local value addition and processing to create a $5 billion tobacco industry by 2025. Farai Makutuya, CGTN, Harare, Zimbabwe.
Now, the Africa Finance Corporation, it's a Pan-African multilateral development financial body set up back in 2007, has announced that it's now reached 31 member states, constituting more than half, effectively, of the continent. In the first quarter of the year, membership by Burkina Faso, the DRC and Morocco added up to that 31 member states number. In an attempt to bridge Africa's infrastructure gap, the AFC has, up to date, invested over $8.7 billion in projects in at least 35 different countries. The DFI usually invests in infrastructure assets that it believes provides essential services in key sectors. Power, natural resources, heavy industry, transport and communications are the sort of thing that it usually puts capital into. Now, we have explored in great detail on this program the enormous funding gap that African economies face as far as getting money to build critical infrastructure is concerned. But given the fact that we do need to cut emissions, but at the same time we need to provide better transportation, more access to energy, does this present an interesting opportunity, a marriage of opportunity perhaps? Let's explore that in a bit more detail. Professor Chukwumerije Okereke joins us now from London. He specializes in global environmental and climate governance. He's been part of the authors on the IPCC report that examined the impact of average warming over 1.5 degrees. Thank you very much for your time this evening, Professor Okereke. So you've described this as the biggest opportunity for green growth across Africa. But with capital as expensive as it is for many African sovereigns, doesn't that limit the continent's ability to take advantage of this opportunity?
Well, only partially. You see, my good friend, we now know from research that the levelized cost
of harvesting, exploring, and transmitting wind, solar, and geothermal energy can be actually quite cheaper than the levelized cost of electricity coming from nuclear and sometimes even fossil fuel. So yes, finance is a factor, but much more importantly, the greatest hindrance is still the lack of political will and the lack of those that have vested interest in the existing fossil fuel economy to diversify or divest their investment from fossil fuel to support what we call the energy of the future. And we see that the subsidies that are going into fossil fuel is still sometimes up to 20 times, 10 times, 15 times, and in some cases, 30 times more than the subsidies or investments that are going into the energy of the future, like geothermal, wind, solar, and other modernized sources of energy. And so I think what is happening here is what we call a capture, the politics of capture. Finance is important, but it is not the full story.
All right. In your response, you've covered one of the main arguments about why Nigeria is essentially still heavily reliant on fossil fuels for its power. But I'm looking across the rest of the market, right? You're looking at sub-Saharan Africa, projects like Grand Inga, which, if developed, would solve a lot of our power supply problems in one stroke. That's basically untapped. 10 gigawatts of untapped geothermal potential in Kenya. Vast solar power potential all across sub-Saharan Africa. Why is it still so difficult to get these projects off the ground? Is it that all of these markets are so fragmented, so when investors are looking at them, they're saying, well, perhaps, they're not economically viable if I'm just investing in one particular country?
That is part of it, and that's why we are asking African countries to pool their resources. In some cases, it makes more economic sense when an investor knows, for example, that if he invests in electricity distribution or electricity generation from Kenya, they can sell not only to Kenya, but to neighboring countries. And so the fragmentation of the market and the lack of what we call good governance system is a major challenge that Africa is confronting. That is why not only do African countries need to act on this, they also need to act from the EU or even the sub-regional economic levels like ECOWAS or East African Economic Community. But also, as I've indicated in the past, there is the politics of interest that needs to be addressed here. The capture by the fossil fuel industry and other economic actors that have vested interest in the fossil fuel, government have to be able to confront this interest. Otherwise, Africa will wake up one day and find out that the rest of the world has moved. And in fact, there are many African countries that are actually already beginning to find it difficult to attract finance to invest in fossil fuel. So it is absolutely vital that the market should be defragmented. There have to be pooling of resources and the elaboration of governance frameworks to enable a collective of Africans come together to be able to develop these absolutely fascinating and interesting renewable energy sources, which Africa is very, very abundantly blessed with.
Indeed. Unfortunately, we're running out of time there, Professor Okereke, so we'll have to leave it there for the time being. But thank you very much for your insights on the program tonight. We appreciate it. Now, away from the business of dealing with green energy, let's get back to fossil fuels, which we still rely on pretty much across the continent. All grades of fuel in South Africa will be more expensive in July when the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy adjusts the price of fuel at the pump. As according to the Automobile Association, here's Angela Coppola with the details.
The Automobile Association forecast that petrol looks set to increase by 23 cents per litre, diesel by 38 cents per litre, and illuminating paraffin 32 cents per litre. In June, there was a 10 cents per litre cut in the petrol price and a 21% hike in the price of diesel.
This increase is going to have a big impact on not only on the economy, the macro economy, but on the individual finances of very many South Africans. And the reason for that is that diesel is obviously an input cost. So when that cost goes up, manufacturers, the agricultural sector, people who rely on freight to move goods around the country, they will see that in their input costs, and they will see those rise, and they will pass those input costs on to consumers.
While producers will pass on those input costs as soon as there's an increase, they are less likely to drop their prices as quickly when the fuel price drops.
Obviously, when the price comes down, you need to be in a position where you can say that that's going to be a sustainable decrease over a period of months. And when there are sustainable decreases over a period of months, I think it does filter in that you do see some decreases over a period of time. They're not as immediate because obviously there's this hedging and waiting to see what's going to happen in the next month and the month after that, and perhaps even the month after that.
The South African fuel prices are controlled by the price of oil and the country's currency exchange rate, which has depreciated some 2.9% year to date.
They're not as significant as we've seen in the past. They could have been a lot worse. But obviously, the increasing international oil price is something that we've got to keep an eye on. The rand has been stabilizing against the US dollar, which is good news. But unfortunately, those gains weren't enough to offset those increases in the oil price.
The increase in the fuel price will affect everyone, directly and indirectly, and it's not likely to change anytime soon as that price elasticity stays in place. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Time now for a short break. Here's what's coming up next. The Chinese ride-hailing giant Didi Global raises over $4 billion as it lists on the New York stock market. And the COVID-19 pandemic has dealt a $4 trillion blow to international tourism.
Holding guns. Machine guns from police forces towards the protesters.
Were you worried about your life at that particular time? Not at all.
Thank you very much for your time. What is your assessment of the state of the continent today?
Africa has the potential to power itself.
Excuse me.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are these stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Welcome back to the program. Let's run through some of the stories making your headlines at this hour, starting in Ethiopia. The government over there says it has withdrawn its army from most of Tigray because the Tigray People's Liberation Front, in its view, is no longer a threat to its sovereignty. Now, since November last year, government troops have been fighting forces loyal to the TPLF, that's the former ruling party in Tigray. Ethiopian officials say that it's now the TPLF that should be held accountable for everything happening there, including humanitarian aid actors. In Somalia, political leaders have agreed to hold long-delayed presidential elections on the 10th of October. That decision comes after months of deadlock that at times turned violent. The National Consultative Council issued the country's election schedule. It also agreed on a 50% reduction of registration fees for female candidates who are vying for parliamentary seats. 16 countries pledged to support Libya's unity government at the most recent Berlin conference. But while they did express commitment to assisting Libya to hold elections in December and withdraw foreign fighters, no specific plan has yet been agreed to. And in China, a grand celebration is being planned in the capital, Beijing, to mark 100 years of the Communist Party of China. The main festivities will be held at Tiananmen Square on Thursday. The General Secretary of the CPC Central Committee, Xi Jinping, who's also the country's president, will address that event. That's a run through your headlines. Onto the capital markets. The Chinese ride-hailing giant Didi Global has raised $4.4 billion in its IPO on the New York Stock Exchange. That marks the biggest Chinese listing in the U.S. ever since Alibaba's $25 billion share sale happened back in 2014. But what are the growth prospects for Didi and what risks does the company face? Our correspondent, Wei-Ling Tang, finds out.
Almost a decade ago in China, standing by the road trying to hail a cab was pretty standard. And sometimes you might not even have been able to get one. These days, though, you only need to tap your phone for a car to come and pick you up. The domestic success of Chinese ride-hailing giant Didi has changed the game, and it's now listed on the New York Stock Exchange.
There are many transportation modes in China today. Sometimes when it's really jammed, hailing a Didi or taking the bus adds up to the same thing. In this situation, I'll opt to take the subway or ride a shared bike.
I use Didi up to 5 times a week, but these days there are many other ride-hailing options available on apps like Baidu Maps. Also, when I head out of town to smaller cities, Didi may not actually have that many cars.
Didi started its mobility business 9 years ago, in 2012. Fast forward to 2021, it had 377 million annual active users in China. This makes up over 76% of its 493 million global platform users, and more than a quarter of the country's population.
For now, over 90% of Didi's revenues still come from its home turf, China. Foreign markets accounted for less than 2% of its total revenues as of end March 2021. Now, in its listing prospectus, Didi said it plans to use 30% of its IPO net proceeds to grow its presence in selected international markets outside of China. Given that the company hasn't made operating profits here in China yet, what should be the strategy for the company for both its local market as well as its overseas ventures in the coming years?
For the domestic market, because the market share in Tier 1 and 2 is already pretty high, and they have a big user base, which is an asset for them to diversify into related business like goods delivery, two-wheelers, home moving, etc., and even food delivery. But for international markets, it's more of an expansion of their current core business, which is e-hailing.
This comes as analysts say Didi's growth in big Chinese cities has stalled. The company began expanding outside of China in 2018. Globally, it operates across 15 countries, including Brazil and Mexico.
Either from growth perspective or from competition perspective, it's necessary for them to go global, because you never know where your next competitor came from. Yeah, if you don't capture this market, it will anyway captured by someone else.
For Leo, he cites a potential regulatory crackdown as a major risk for the company. Chinese authorities have recently increased scrutiny on local technology companies when it comes to anti-monopoly practices.
On one side, they were already blamed for manipulating the price as the market consolidates, and they have that kind of dominant position to make the price, right? And the second thing is they expanding into many related businesses, which can also be monopoly suspicion from regulatory perspective.
Leo says there are 2 things that Didi should do in this regard. First, make its pricing mechanism transparent, and second, be cautious in how it treats its competitors.
I think the way they've opened the platform to smaller operators is a good practice.
As a market leader, Leo says Didi has a responsibility to guarantee the health of the entire industry and sector. Wei-Ling Tang, CGTN, Shanghai.
And in shares ended slightly lower on Wednesday. Domestic equity market indices climbed off the morning gains thanks to declining COVID-19 cases and a surge in vaccinations, but they did end the day in the red. As the day before the weekly options expiry, now among sectors except IT, all other indices ended the day much lower. The BSE Sensex erased over 393 points from the day's end to close at 52,483 points, down about 0.1%. The Nifty 50, that was down by about 0.2%, settling at 15,721 points. Both indices were set to end June more than 1.4% higher, scaling record highs several times during the month. But they've struggled to break past those levels decisively so far.
When market touches a new high, it is very common that it triggers some kind of selling. So we see some selling happening on Monday and Tuesday, and then when market goes down again, the buying re-emerges.
Economic losses are mounting in developing countries due to the absence of widespread COVID-19 vaccines. The crash in international tourism traffic and spending due to the coronavirus pandemic is leading the charge, and it could cause a loss of more than $4 trillion to global GDP, both in 2020 and 2021, that's according to UNCTAD. Here's CGTN's Alexander Majala with the rest of that story.
International tourism arrivals are set to stagnate this year, except for some Western markets. According to a UN study, this will cause up to $2.4 trillion in further global losses in the sector, and it's not expected to rebound fully until 2023.
What we are looking at the long run is that the majority of experts are looking at meeting the 2019 numbers after 2023.
COVID-19 vaccination and certificates are key to restoring confidence in foreign tourism, which provides a lifeline to many countries, especially jobs in small island states.
The vaccination rollout in Europe is quite advanced when we compare to other regions. The same will probably occur in the US, but we will definitely see domestic tourism recovering first. We're already seeing, in some cases, the demand for domestic almost at the levels of 2019. Of course, this is a big challenge for those countries who depend on international tourism.
In 2020, international arrivals plunged by 73% from pre-pandemic levels in 2019, causing estimated losses of $2.4 trillion in tourism and related sectors.
Decline in GDP is again quite dramatic. So we find here, under the pessimistic scenario, that the loss could be again in 2021 a 2.4 trillion of global GDP. In the optimistic scenario, that's a bit better. It's a loss of 1.7 trillion US dollar. And in the scenario with different speeds, the decline is similar to the optimistic scenario. It's 1.8 trillion US dollar.
The UNWTO says that it will be a very diverse recovery, varying by country and by region. The European Union's digital COVID-19 certificate, due to come into force on Thursday, July 1st, represents the only regional harmonization to date and hope for robust cross-border travel. Alexandria Majala for CGTN.
Brazil produces more trash than any other country in Latin America, but it only recycles roughly 1% of the trash it produces, and even then, that's mostly thanks to the back-breaking work of people who have to pick through the garbage. One organization, though, is trying to make their lives easier. It's opened a park in Rio de Janeiro that's aimed at both reducing unemployment but also boost recycling. Roquetia Franco has that story on What's Hot tonight.
Every day, 23-year-old Ana Carolina Rodriguez drags large bags through the streets of Rio de Janeiro, filled with plastic, paper, and other recyclable materials. A former cook who lost her job last year due to the COVID-19 pandemic, she's now among the tens of thousands of people in Brazil making a living as waste pickers.
I'm really afraid of catching the virus. Everybody is, and of facing all sorts of hardships. But my biggest fear now is not having food or somewhere to sleep.
But now she can sell what she collects at Rio Park Recicla, Rio's first recycling park, a cooperative pilot project that opened in August 2020. Some make up to $400 per month, double the country's minimum wage. Edson Freitas, one of the park's founders, says few know that waste pickers in Brazil are responsible for 90% of all recycling in the country, and there are now more of them than ever.
In the state of Rio de Janeiro alone, there are currently 600,000 people collecting reusable materials because of the pandemic and have found an alternative to earn money in the recycling business.
The park is an example of waste management and social inclusion in Brazil, and it's offering extra benefits for what it says is an invisible but vital workforce for the country's industries. And since most waste pickers don't have bank accounts, they can get paid with these cards that can be used to buy food, pay bills, and they're even more valuable than cash.
The main goal of our card is safety for these vulnerable people, but now recyclable buyers are adding bonuses to the cards to get the material they need the most. It is a win-win situation.
The push now is to replicate parks like this one across Rio to help more people like Ana Carolina survive with dignity while playing a key role for the city's environment. Lucrecia Franco, CGTN, Rio de Janeiro.
Quick run through commodity prices. So halfway into the year, oil really has been the star over the last 6 months. Brent is up 46%. WTI crude is up by over 50%. You're seeing that rise in fuel prices feeding into inflation, as we'll see a little later on in the program. Today, incidentally, was also Ivan Glassenberg's final day as a CEO of Glencore, effectively ending a 34 years run at the helm of that massive commodity trading firm. He remains an ardent backer of coal. And remember, that's a commodity that produces around 20% of the firm's earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation and amortization. And he's not alone either. Thermal coal prices are still rising. Anglo-American spin-off of its coal assets, Thungela Resources, that's gone up by over 70% ever since it hit the market in early June. Here's what's coming up next. Farmers in Nigeria venture to adopt advanced techniques to boost output and hedge against climate change.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
You don't find the stories of North Africa by sitting on the sidelines. No one else will take you where we can in North Africa. And no one else will show you what it's all about. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to the program. One last story for you in this hour, this time focusing on farming in Nigeria. Smallholder farmers over there exploring different techniques in order to boost their food output. Climate change and insecurity have been pushing a lot more agripreneurs in that part of the world to opt for soilless farming techniques, and hydroponics are getting a lot of attention. CGTN's Kelechi Emekalam has that story on Grassroots.
For 5 years.
Farm Lab's head trainer, Samson Ogbole, taking his students through a training session on soilless farming. The biochemist turned farmer started his agri-tech company in 2012 as part of efforts to bypass the seasonality of food production. Despite skepticism from various quarters, Samson's recorded success, and he's now raising a new generation of agri enthusiasts.
The first thing I had to overcome especially when I launched outwards, to get people to see as they ask questions around, is this healthy? I actually had research work to show experimentally that this is healthy even in the lab. There were questions around, does this ensure food security? And looking at the 5 metrics of gauging food security, it meant all the 5. Then the next or the last part of the question, which is where we are right now, is how financially or economically viable is this compared to traditional farming? We are gradually showing people, yes, the setup cost may be higher compared to traditional farming, but a good business does not look at your setup cost, but rather the running cost. And considering that the running cost is way cheaper compared to traditional farming.
Hydroponic farming is a soilless technique of growing crops in nutrient solutions. Food insecurity has been at the center of conversations here. According to the UN Food and Agricultural Organization, FAO, no less than 9.2 million Nigerians are faced with a crisis of worse levels of food insecurity. The figures are expected to increase to 12.8 million by August 2021. Issues of climate change and insecurity, especially in the northern farming communities, have been disrupted. So for many, the hydroponic technique seems like a viable option.
I'm here to learn how to grow plants soillessly without soil, due to the fact that we have floods coming into our regions every other year for the past 4-5 years. So we're looking for alternative means to grow plants and how we can actually teach others how to grow their own plants, innovative way of farming. That way we can have enough food crops in our state. With what I've learned here, we could practically start growing tomatoes soillessly. We could actually elevate crop production.
Despite the unique benefits of the technique, there are problems of low awareness. Also, the system is limited to some crops like tomatoes.
The area where government should come out should be more of sensitization and exposing a lot of old people to hydroponics farming system. Through advocacy, capacity building, and support in terms of infrastructure needed.
Ogbole has spent the last 7 years training over 10,000 young agripreneurs. He believes that agribusiness is at the core of sustainable development and job creation, but technology-driven agriculture like hydroponic farming would drive young Nigerians towards wealth generation. Kelechi Emekalam, CGTN Abuja, Nigeria.
And we wrap up the program with a run through the currencies. The South African Reserve Bank turned 100 today, so happy birthday to the institution. Kenya also released its inflation data today. So June's inflation hit a 15-month high, 6.32%, with rises in the food and the non-alcoholic beverages and transport indices accounting for a large chunk of that rise. On an annual basis, Kenya is actually spending nearly 15% more on transport in June than they did a year ago. Of the African currencies we track here, only 3, the Kenyan shilling, the rand and the Egyptian pound, they still have gains against the dollar on a year-to-date basis. Those are your currencies, and that's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content you've seen here in the last hour. If anyways, get your thoughts back to us, all of them on your screens right now. Thank you for your company in the last hour. I'm Ramah Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. The World Today is up next from Washington, D.C.